Welcome back to the Nick and Joe show. I had to turn my mic on there.
Where'd Nick go?
I'm Joe, and he was Nick, and Nick obviously thought that we had more time in this break than we gave him, but
Maybe he
that's
figured I was
okay.
going to play the entire Carly Simon and Mac Davis catalog.
I don't know. It's yeah.
45-minute free ride. Nick's taking.
Anyway, yeah. The so this is segment number 3 in this week's Nick and Joe show, and we've been talking about inquiries and gun control, etc. So if you missed those segments and discussions, and I think that was pretty fiery. It's we have a good dynamic going here, even though we pretty much agree on most subjects. And hey, there's Nick. Welcome back, Nick, to the Nick and Joe show.
Yeah, gee, thanks. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. Nice to have you here, Nick.
Yeah. It's when you get older, the bathroom breaks come a little faster.
So, so Alberta, Alberta, and gosh, I mean, I had a meeting with someone today, and we were talking about Alberta, and I don't know. It's Alberta politics it's just turned into a bit of a basket case, and the new premier, Danielle Smith, has just introduced. She's been doing quite a few things. She was only recently elected the leader of the United Conservative Party in Alberta, the UCP, and then she was elected in a by-election not quite a month ago. Actually, it was the same night of the midterm, the same day as the midterm elections in the United States. So what was that, November 8th or 9th or thereabouts? So she now has a seat in the legislature, and she's been doing a few things, making some waves, etc. And she recently introduced a piece of legislation, Nick, and maybe I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, it's called the sovereignty bill, and I won't read the whole article or anything, but in essence, the bill allows Alberta to is resist the right word, or to ignore legislation that comes out of Ottawa that is in the government's opinion damaging to Albertans. Now, first of all, there are a couple of things about this particular piece of legislation that I don't know if I want any government to have this kind of power. They've given themselves almost like a monarch's kind of power, where if a law comes down, they can go through the parliament, their assembly. I forget what they call it in Alberta. Is it an assembly or like Queen's Park? They have the National
Legislative
Assembly in
Assembly.
Quebec. Legislative Assembly. Okay, we'll call it that. Anyway, they can reject a law from Ottawa, but then the premier and the cabinet can put in place restrictions or things along that line without having to go back to the assembly to get them approved. Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Kathy. You're quite right. It's so these are the kind of powers. I don't know because look, I don't know Danielle Smith. I do know I like some of the things she's doing. She's certainly, and this is as much Ottawa's fault that this has come to this, because they're the ones who have been beaten on Alberta for years. And I think the people out west have just had enough of it. And that's where they add, that is where this appetite for this kind of thing comes from. Because let's face it, now, yeah, but see, Kathy, I think the thing is that even if the Supreme Court said it's not, there's still the notwithstanding clause, and they can pull the trigger on the notwithstanding clause, and they've got another 5 years where they don't have to deal with it. And just like Quebec does with their language laws, they can pull the trigger every 5 years, and they can ignore anything that the Supreme Court says. So I don't think that it's even if whether it is or isn't is a moot point, I guess is what I'm saying. There is that mechanism within the Constitution that allows them to do this. and to keep it. And if I'm wrong on this, Joseph will set me straight, I'm sure, but I'm pretty sure that's the way it works. Now,
Well,
to have that kind of power, I mean, let's say that Daniel Smith uses it only for good, okay? But what happens if Notley gets back in, or we have somebody else that is a leans hard to the left instead of more to the right, or has a different philosophy about governance that the people don't like or not interested in? Um, that's what worries me. It's like, look, you might use this piece of legislation correctly the way it is, but what about 20 years from now? Because they don't repeal this stuff, it just stacks up in the library, and it gets dusty, and when they want to use it, they pull it out, dust it off, and there you go. A famous example is that unless they've repealed this, it's still legal to drive a herd of sheep down Yonge Street in Toronto, and you can't stop them. They can stop traffic. There's certain legislation. Cars and trucks are supposed to have a guy walk 50 feet in front of them with a red flag, because when those laws were written, cars were very unique, and driving sheep down Yonge Street was just daily life, and nobody ever bothered to repeal that law. Now, I'm using an extreme example to make the point that with this kind of power, with the ability to circumvent federal laws, in the right hands is something I'm not worried about. But if it ends up in the wrong hands, now you've got a monster that you don't want. And that's why it's better for the government to have less power than more.
well, Nick, I think what's happening in Alberta right now is it's almost a putting a lens up against what's going on beneath the surface right across the country. There's a general dissatisfaction with the way we're being governed,
Right.
and I'm not just talking about policies, but there's a sense of frustration that our rulers. You see, I'm even using the term now. Rulers, our elected representatives are out of touch, are not interested. There's in in doing anything but really ruling over us, and usually in a way that, at least in their minds, is beneficial to us as individuals and collectively to society. And that makes sometimes the argument against what they're doing very difficult. Gun control, as we talked about in the first segment of the show tonight, is a good example of that, or at least not gun control per se, but the new gun control regulations that they're trying to enact. So, but all of this really is not relevant for the reasons actually that you've cited, Nick, and that is that ultimately governments in our system of government, and to a lesser degree in the United States, uh, really they get to do what they want to do. And it's very hard to stop them from doing things. And yeah, you can go to court. And in the United States, when the Supreme Court rules on something, that's the final word, unless you can
Right.
find a way, around it. But here we have the notwithstanding clause, which is in our Constitution, which allows a province to basically say, whatever the court rules, we're going to suspend that ruling as it applies to this particular piece of legislation for 5 years, because we think the legislation is more important. And it used to be that was written into the Constitution and into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms under the leadership of Pierre Trudeau, as it happens, in order to preserve what was the sovereignty of Parliament, as opposed to some sort of a written constitution that could be where you would pass legislation like the Bill of Rights, which was not originally constitutional, and so you'd have to change the legislation, or you could easily change the legislation. We could get into a whole discussion about all this stuff, but the bottom line is this: ultimately, these guys can do pretty much whatever they want. They have their fingers on the buttons of the mechanism of government. They have the authorities. They have the bureaucracy. etc., etc., etc. So there are two responses to this. First of all, is that whether it's good or it's bad is irrelevant. Okay, you don't want the government to be big and powerful, even for good reasons, because a government that can give you everything is a government that could take away
Can take
everything,
everything.
as
That's
this
right.
as the saying goes, and it's
I want to
absolutely
get to.
true. So you
I
want to
want to
have
get
a
to. Go ahead.
okay. So
Finish your thought.
let me just make this point. You want to
Okay.
have a government that's limited, but the most important lesson in all of this is you have to stop voting for the red team or the blue team, and you have to start looking at your individual representative, and you have to ask your individual representatives during an election campaign. The question you need to be resolving in your mind is, do I trust this individual's judgment? I want somebody who's going to act. We understand there's a party system here, and there are historical reasons why the party system came into being. It wasn't just invented. There are good reasons why having political parties work. I'm not in favor of getting rid of political parties. I don't think that's a workable solution. But even in a political party system, the character and the quality of the people that you're electing is essential. And so those are the two things. You want limited government, but you also have to take responsibility as voters to ensure that
Okay.
you're not just voting for somebody because they're part of the red team or the blue team, but that you're voting for somebody because you trust their judgment. That's really quite important.
Okay. Now, Kathy from Calgary has asked a very important question. I'm going to read it out so the people listening can hear it. And she says, we used to be able to go beyond the Supreme Court of Canada to the UK, and I think it was the Privy Council. Is that still in law? It has been used in decades, but she wondered if it's still there practically. In other
Yeah,
words, in theory at least. Now,
yeah. I
I
have an answer
think
to that.
okay. Well, let me give you mine, and then you can set me straight. I think that the repatriate the that we in 1932 we got that was the west what do they call that? I want to call it the Westminster Abbey, but that's not it.
No, the Statute
Um,
of Westminster, 1931.
yeah, okay, that's when we fully became a country as we understand it today. And at that point, there was no more going to the Privy Council. We had to resolve our own issues within our own borders. Do I understand that right?
Well, there was certainly with the passing of the Statute of Westminster, there was a relinquishing of more legislative and executive power or authority or autonomy, but it was possible in judicial matters still until we had a Supreme Court, because at that time we didn't have a Supreme Court here. So ultimately, the Supreme Court was a body of the in England, in the UK, that would ultimately rule on issues, and they still do, but not for Canada. So the truth is that we don't have any route of appeal to the UK in any way, shape, or form anymore.
No, yeah, not even through the monarch. That's all symbolic.
No, not even through the monarchy.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's all
I mean,
symbolic.
you look constitutionally, okay, it's a gray area, because ultimately, um, there's no law, if you want to use that term, that says that the king or the queen, or I guess I might as well just get used to saying
And the
the king or
king.
the king's representative here in Canada. There's no law that says they absolutely must endorse or sign off on any particular piece of legislation that passes through Parliament federally or through a provincial legislature. But okay, you understand that if the king's representative, whether it's the governor general federally or the lieutenant governor provincially, was to refuse to sign off on a piece of legislation, which is constitutionally necessary for that legislation, for that act to become law,
That's
if
true.
they were to refuse to sign off on it, then that would precipitate a constitutional crisis. And I think the safe bet would be to say that we would probably end up saying, well, giving the monarchy the heave ho. So nobody wants to defy the duly elected will of the people as expressed through their legislature. But,
Okay, well, that's
you know, if you
so
have yahoos
to
running the
boil it down.
legislature, what are you going to do?
Yeah. So to boil it down to its essence, we do not have any other access except what we have. What no any other
Yeah.
remedy other than what we have in Canada through the Supreme Court, and even that can be put in check with the notwithstanding clause.
Yeah, but you know, this is the thing is that we're looking sometimes, Nick, I think we spend too much time looking for systemic guarantees. Okay? Somehow or other we have to fix the system so that it's going to control the government, it's going to restrict what the government does or whatever else it's going to do. The fact is that we live in a democracy, and in a democracy it's you and I that have the power. Okay. And so our problem is that we keep on electing people, and this is a much more recent thing than when we were younger. Um, but we keep on electing people who are giving us bad government. And not
Well,
only
I've
that,
said
you know, it's just so distressing. We just had municipal elections here in Ontario, and in those municipal elections, you know, I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of jurisdictions where they had more than 50% voter turnout. And in most cases, the voter turnout for mayors or for city councilors was less than 40%, and in some cases, less than 30%.
yeah,
So
but to be
somebody once coined the phrase that bad politicians are the ones that are elected by good citizens who don't vote. And that's a real problem that we have here as well. But
now
ultimately, you're dealing with people. And whether it's government or it's voters or whatever, people by their very nature, we're flawed. And you're going to have good people and bad people. And you're going to have people are going to make mistakes. They're going to make misjudgments, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very messy business. But again, all of this is why you want limited government.
Well, let me make a point. I want to talk for a second just about the last point that Kathy just made. Um, she said we also have very few good choices for public servants. That's true. It's hard to find somebody with any moral character who has the courage to go through the rectal exam they're going to get when they try to become a public servant. Let's face it, man. You better come out. I think if somebody runs for public office of any caliber at all in this country, what happens? You had better divulge all your skeletons first on day one. Just lay out, say, look, this happened. I was young. I was foolish. I know about this. I apologize for it. Or, maybe maybe you wore blackface, or maybe, who knows what it is. You were arrested for smoking marijuana when it was still illegal, or something, a little, something like that. You better come clean with it, because if you don't, it's going to come up, and they're going to want to know why you didn't mention it. So that's number one. Number two, the people who are the kind of people that we need in office, the high skilled professional type people that we need to be able to run a corporation like the size of the Canadian government or the provincial government, or even in many of the large municipalities, are already making, you without all that hassle, are making 3, 4, 5 times more working in the private sector. So why would they want to take the pay cut and have to put up with all that abuse? Think of Larry O'Brien as a classic example. Now, for our listeners who are not familiar with Ottawa politics, Larry O'Brien was a very successful businessman who ran for office back in the around 2010 or so, in there somewhere. And very successful. He had a software technology company that he built from the ground up, and was very, very well to do. He was not a poor man, and he decided he was sick and tired of the way the city was being run. So he jumped in and he ran it. He ran in the election, got elected. Well, he out of his 4-year tenure, he only really had about 2 years because the unions and the people who didn't like somebody who was more 2006. I knew it was in that bracket. Thank you, John. But they didn't like him because he wasn't liberal enough. He wasn't left enough. I'm not saying he was a hardcore right winger, but in the 2 years he got more done in the 2 years he was in office, or the 4 years, really he only had 2 to work with. Um, he got more done in that time period than the previous 3 mayors combined had gotten done. He Congress Center, you go down the list. Anyway, the point I'm making is that he went through hell for 2 years while he was in office. And other people are looking at him going, I'm as successful as he is. I'm as smart as he is. I've got as much money as he is. I can run major corporations. That find people, because nobody's willing to cut the other guy slack for some of the innocent, or not innocent, some of the mistakes they made in their past. There was a hockey player just recently. The kid was 15. He made some kind of racial remark, and his career is over. I forget what team it was. I think it was one of the American teams. Said, "Oh, sorry, we want nothing to do with him." He was 15, and you just destroyed. And he apologized. He said he's sorry. He wasn't going to do it. He's understands why what he said was painful. He did everything he could to try to, accept responsibility. His career, and he was going to be one of the top prospects in the NHL this year. So it just shows you that if you want good people, you have to allow them to be human. And if you don't allow them to be human, all you're going to get are the people who have got all kinds of things to hide and are very good at hiding them and are terrible leaders. Mitchell Miller, that's it. The Bruins, yes. That's the kid that's been bounced out of the NHL because he said something when he was 15.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, and of course I don't think that was the right thing to do. I wasn't familiar with that particular case.
It's just going on right now.
Look, I understand the frustration, but that's, as I said, democracy is very messy. As Winston Churchill once said, that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
For all the others we've tried.
So it's going to be messy. You're going to get good people in office. You're going to get bad people in office. But the two things that I'm talking about, I think, are that if you follow these two rules, then it won't eliminate the problems. It won't guarantee that we won't have problems, but it's the best chance that we have of having fewer problems. And when we do have problems, of keeping them under control. It's not a guarantee, but it's the best chance that we have. And again, it comes down to good people getting involved in the democratic process at all levels on a serious basis, taking their responsibility as citizens seriously, and looking into people who they want to vote for. If you don't like the people that are presenting themselves, find somebody else and help them to get involved, or get involved yourself. But there's no substitute for good people, responsible people, solid people being involved in the democratic process. That's number one. And number two is we have to, somehow or other, we have to start pulling on the reins of government. Okay, we're depending on them too much. And let me just say this, okay? That's not the government stepping in and forcing most people to give up their freedoms. That's people saying, yeah, we like the government giving us handouts. We like the government doing this. And even in Alberta, okay, where they've just announced that they're going to be increasing payments to people to help them to cope with inflation. And you can't argue with that on compassionate basis, because it is a very compassionate thing to do. But it's the worst thing you could possibly do in an inflationary period, because it feeds inflation. And so the proper thing to do is not to look at how to give people more money to spend. It's how to increase productivity. And by increasing productivity, you then create more jobs. More jobs are created by the economy. And presumably those jobs are going to pay more people, or the wages are going to be higher because you're producing more. So
Well, the problem with, and I'm not, you're absolutely right. I'm not arguing with your logic. The trouble with with using that kind of argument is that emotion trumps logic every time. If you look at, let's take the NDP. Who are the core of their voters? Young people, because they don't have enough life experience yet. They're easily manipulated. They're easily malleable, is a better word, and they also can be riled up and presented with arguments that are flawed, but get them fired up, and they're the ones that get out there. They traditionally don't do that well at the polls because most young people don't vote. In I don't want to say thank God, but that's the truth. But they use emotion. The only reason they exist is because of emotion.
yeah,
Because when you listen to that, to people like Yang Meat Singh, talk about, oh well, we got to do something about the price of meat. We got to do something about, and yet nobody ever carries a thought on to say, well, wait a minute, you're wholly propping up the government that's causing all this trouble. How can you say out of the one side of your mouth, Justin Trudeau's turned his back on the poor, and yet on the other side, you're saying I'm supporting Justin Trudeau. So emotion
yeah,
is always a very difficult thing to counter with
but
logic, common sense, and reason, because most people don't want logic, common sense, and reason. It's why car salesmen are people who when they buy cars, they don't do it on what's the best car for them. They do it on the one they want. They fall in love with the car, and that's it. It doesn't matter if it's practical. They'll buy it anyway.
yeah, but Nick, it's not young people. Okay, there is an issue with younger people, and particularly the fact that we're so poorly educated these days. We have
Well,
our
that's also
heads
true.
filled with so much crap in our education system, except for the fundamentals. Okay,
Yeah.
and if you don't have the fundamentals right, then you can be pulled off in any direction. But I said this a couple of weeks ago, and I'll say it again. It's not younger people that are causing the problem. This is a baby boomer problem. It's older people that are causing this problem. The people who do vote, and they vote NDP, and they vote Liberal, and they vote Conservative, but they only vote for Conservatives who are not really conservatives. Okay, but they're Liberals, but they don't want to join the red team, so they're Liberals on the blue team. I'm saying red and blue reversed here in Canada. Red is
Right.
Liberal, blue is Conservative. That's really largely where the problem lies, and it's the idea that we're going to have. I mean, who we're going to have uh, defined benefit as opposed to defined contribution pensions. Well, who in their right mind would do that? Except for the people in government, the bureaucrats, the elected officials who would do that when it comes to public service pensions, but also the public service employees who are all baby boomers who were demanding it and asking for it. And I don't see anybody saying, wow, things are really screwed up. And the public service pension fund is a very serious problems, okay? But I don't see anybody in the public service coming back and saying, well, okay, maybe I'll give up a few shekels with my on my pension in order, to benefit the country. Nobody does that. So there's a lot of
Sorry.
bottom line is this, okay? There's lots of blame to go around. But ultimately, the problem is not systemic. The problem is people, and
Societal.
it's the problem is always with people. Whatever system you design, whatever checks and balances you build into the system, there are always going to be people that are going to use it or abuse it or whatever. Okay, and that's what politics is. That's what democracy is. It's all about people. And so
All
what you
right.
have to start doing is we have to start looking not just at policy, but we also have to be looking at character.
Well, when we come back from this break, Mark Philippe makes a great point. He says more jobs. Where are all the people? Companies are begging to find employees, and he's right. and there's answers to that I think we probably should get into, because it kind of dovetails into some of what you're talking about, part of it at least. So we'll pick that up on the other side of the break. In the meantime, you guys stay right there. We'll be right back after this on the Nick and Joe Show.